Hello, everybody. I am Mrs. Poppet, and this is my place. Welcome again for another story time. I do so much enjoy our being together and having us share all these wonderful tales. Today I have a story called The Traveling Companion. You may have heard of it, but you may not have. It is a wonderful story about being good and doing the right thing, and about love. I think you'll like it very much. The Traveling Companion. Poor John was very sad, for his father was so ill he had no hope of recovery. John sat alone with the sick man in the little room, and the lamp had nearly burned out, for it was late in the night. "You have been a good son, John," said the sick father, "and God will help you in the world." He looked at him as he spoke with mild, earnest eyes, drew a deep sigh, and died. Yet it appeared as if he still slept. John wept bitterly. He had no one in the wide world now, neither father, mother, brother, nor sister. Poor John! He knelt by the bed and kissed his dead father's hand and wept many, many, many bitter tears. But at last his eyes closed and he fell asleep with his head resting against the hard bedpost. Then he dreamed a strange dream. He thought he saw the sun shining upon him and his father alive and well, and even heard him laughing as he used to when he was very happy. A beautiful girl with a golden crown on her head and long shining hair gave him her hand, and his father said, "See what a bride you have won! She is the loveliest maiden on earth." Then he awoke, and all the beautiful things vanished. Before his eyes his father lay dead on the bed, and he was all alone. Poor John! During the following week the dead man was buried, and the son walked behind the coffin which contained his father, whom he so dearly loved, and would never ever again behold. He heard the earth fall on the coffin lid till only a corner of it remained in sight, and at last that also disappeared. He felt as if his heart would break with the weight of the sorrow, till those who stood around the grave sang a song, and the sweet, holy tones brought tears to his eyes, which relieved him. The sun shone brightly down on the green trees, as if it would say, "You must not be sorrowful, John. Do you see the beautiful blue sky above you? Your father is up there, and he prays to the loving Father of all that you may do well in the future." "I will always be good," said John, "and then I shall go be with my father in heaven. What joy it will be when we see each other again! How much I shall have to relate to him, and how many things he will be able to explain to me of the delights of heaven, and teach me as he once did on earth. Oh, what a joy it will be!" He pictured it all so plainly to himself that he smiled even while the tears ran down his cheeks. The little birds in the chestnut tree twittered, "Tweet, tweet." They were so happy, although they had seen the funeral, but they seemed as if they knew that the dead man was now in heaven, and that he had wings much larger and more beautiful than their own. And he was happy now because he had been good here on earth, and they were glad of it. John saw them fly away out of the green trees into the wide world, and he longed to fly with them. But first he cut out a large wooden cross to place on his father's grave. And when he brought it there in the evening, he found the grave had been decked out with gravel and flowers. Strangers had done this, they who had known the good old father who was now dead, and who had loved him very much. Early the next morning, John packed up his little bundle of clothes and placed all his money, which consisted of $50 and a few shillings, in a girdle. With this he determined to try his fortune in the wide world. But first he went into the churchyard, and by his father's grave he offered up a prayer and said, Farewell." At last he passed through the fields. All the flowers looked fresh and beautiful in the warm sunshine, and nodded in the wind as if they wished to say to him, "Welcome to the green wood where all is fresh and bright." Then John turned to have one more look at the old church in which he'd been christened in his infancy, and where his father had taken him every Sunday to hear the service and join in the singing and psalms. As he looked at the old tower, he espied the ringer standing at one of the narrow openings with its little pointed red cap on its head and shading his eyes from the sun with his bent arm. John nodded farewell to him, and the little ringer waved his red cap, laid his hand on his heart, and kissed his hand to wish him many great times, to show that he felt kindly towards him and wished him a prosperous journey. John continued on his journey and thought of all the wonderful things he should see in the large, beautiful world, till he found himself farther away from home than he'd ever been before. He did not even know the names of the places he'd passed through, and could scarcely understand the language of the people he met, for he was far away in a strange land. The first night he slept on a haystack out in the field, for there was no other bed for him, but it seemed to him so nice and comfortable that even a king need not wish for better. The field, the brook, the haystack with the blue sky above formed a beautiful sleeping room. The green grass with the little red and white flowers was the carpet. The elder bushes and the hedges of wild roses looked like garlands on the walls, and for a bath he could have the clear fresh water of the brook. While rushes bowed their heads to him to wish him good morning and good evening. The moon, like a large lamp, hung up high in the blue ceiling, and he had no fear of its setting fire to his curtains. John slept here quite safely all night, and when he awoke the sun was up, and all the little birds were singing around him. "Good morning, good morning, are you not up yet?" It was Sunday, and bells were ringing for church. As the people went in, John followed them. He heard God's word, joined in the singing of the psalms, and listened to the preacher. It seemed to him as if he were in his own church where he had been christened and had sung psalms with his father. Out in the churchyard were several graves, and on some of them the grass had grown very high. John thought of his father's grave, which he knew at last would look like these, and he was not there to read and attend to it. Then he set to work, pulled up the high grass, raised the wooden crosses which had fallen down, and replaced the wreaths which had been blown away from their places by the wind, thinking all the time, "Perhaps someone is doing the same for my father's grave, as I am not there to do it." Outside the church stood an old beggar, leaning on his crutch. John gave him his sterling shillings, and then he continued his journey, feeling lighter and happier than before. Towards evening, the weather became very stormy, and he hastened on as quickly as he could to get shelter. But it was quite dark by the time he reached a little lonely church which stood on a hill. "I will go in there," he said, "and sit down in a corner, for I am quite tired and I want to rest." So he went in and seated himself and folded his hands and offered up his evening prayer, and was soon fast asleep and dreaming, while the thunder rolled and lightning flashed outside. When he awoke it was still night, but the storm had ceased, and the moon shone upon him through the windows. Then he saw an open coffin standing in the center of the church, which contained a dead man, waiting for burial. John was not at all timid. He had a good conscience, and he knew also that the dead can never injure anyone. It is the living, wicked men who do harm to others. Two such wicked persons stood now by the dead man who'd been brought into the church to be buried. Their evil intentions were to throw the poor dead body outside the church door and not leave him to rest in his coffin. "Why do you do this?" asked John, when he saw what they were going to do. "It is very wicked. Leave him to rest in peace in Christ's name." "Nonsense," replied the two dreadful men. "He has cheated us. He owed us money when he could not pay, and now he's dead, and we shall never get a penny. So we mean to have our revenge, and let him die like a dog at the church door." "I have only $50, said John. "It is all I possess in the world, but I will give it to you if you will promise me faithfully to leave the dead man in peace. I shall be able to get on without the money. I have strong and healthy limbs, and God always will help me." "Why, of course," said the horrid men. "If you will pay his debt, we will both promise not to touch him. You may depend on that." And then they took the money he offered, laughed at him for his good nature, and went their way. Then he laid the dead body back in the coffin, folded the hands, and took leave of it, and went away contentedly, though, through the great forest. All around him he could see the prettiest little elves dancing in the moonlight, which shone through the trees. They were not disturbed by his appearance, for they knew he was good and harmless. They are wicked people only who can never glimpse the fairies. Some of them were not taller than the breadth of a finger, and they wore golden combs in their long yellow hair. They were rocking themselves to get two together on large dewdrops, with which the leaves and the high grass were sprinkled. Sometimes the dewdrops would roll away, and then they fell down between the stems of long grass and caused a great deal of laughing and noise among other little people. It was quite charming to watch them at play. They sang songs, and John remembered that he had learned those pretty songs when he was a little boy. Large speckled spiders with silver crowns on their heads were employed to spin suspension bridges and palaces from one hedge to another, and when the tiny drops fell upon them, they glittered in the moonlight like shining glass. This continued until sunrise. Then the little elves crept into the flower buds, and the wind seized the bridges and palaces and fluttered them in the air like cobwebs. As John left the wood, a strong man's voice called after him, "Hello, comrade, where are you traveling?" "Into the wide world," he replied. "I am only a poor lad. I have neither father nor mother, but God will help me." "I am going into this wide world also," replied the stranger. "Shall we keep each other company?" "With all my heart," he said, and so they went on together. Soon they began to like each other very much, for they were both good. But John found out that the stranger was much cleverer than him. He had traveled all over the world and could describe just about everything. The sun was high in the heavens when they seated themselves under a large tree to eat their breakfast, and at the same moment an old woman came towards them. She was very old and almost bent double. She leaned upon a stick and carried on her back a bundle of firewood, which she had collected in the forest, and her apron was tied around it. And John saw 3 great stems of fern and some willow twigs peeping out. Just as she came close to them, her foot slipped, and she fell to the ground screaming, "Ah!" loudly. The poor old woman, she had broken her leg. John proposed directly that they should carry the old woman home to her cottage, but the stranger opened his knapsack and took out a box in which he said he had salve that would quickly make her leg well and strong again, so she would be able to walk home herself, as if her leg had never been broken. And all that he would ask in return was the 3 fern stems which she carried in her apron. "That is a rather too high price," said the old woman, nodding her head quite strangely. She did not seem at all inclined to part with the fern stems. However, it was not very agreeable to lie there with a broken leg, so she gave them to him, And such was the power of the ointment that no sooner had he rubbed it on her leg than the old mother rose up and walked even better than she'd done before. But this was then a wonderful ointment that could not even be brought to a chemist. "What can you want with those 3 fern rods?" asked John of his fellow traveler. "Oh, they will make capital brooms," he said, "and I like them because I have strange whims sometimes." And they walked together for a long distance. "How dark the sky is becoming," said John. "Look at those thick, heavy clouds." "Those are not clouds," replied his fellow traveler. "They are mountains, large, lofty mountains, on the tops of which we should be, above the clouds, in pure, free air. Believe me, it is delightful to ascend so high. Tomorrow we shall be there." But the mountains were not so near as they appeared, and they had to travel a whole day before they reached them, and passed through black forests and piles of rocks as a large town. The journey had been so fatiguing that John and his fellow traveler stopped to rest at a roadside inn, so that they might gain their strength for their journey on the morrow. In the large public room of the inn, a great many persons were assembled to see a comedy performed by dolls. The showman had just erected his little theater, and the people were sitting around the room to witness the performance. Right in front, in the very best place, sat a stout butcher, with a great bulldog by his side, who seemed very much inclined to bite. He sat staring with all his eyes, and so indeed did everyone else in the room. And then the play began. It was a pretty piece, with a king and a queen in it, who sat on beautiful thrones and had gold crowns on their heads. The train to their dresses were very long, according to the fashion, while the prettiest of wooden dolls with glass eyes and large mustaches stood at the door, and opened and shut them that the fresh air might come into the room. It was a very pleasant play, not at all mournful, but just as the queen stood up and walked towards the stage, the great bulldog, who should have been held back by his master, made a spring forward and caught the queen in the teeth by a slender wrist, so it snapped in two. This was a dreadful disaster. The poor man who was exhibiting the dolls was much annoyed, and quite sad about his queen. She was the prettiest doll he had, and the bulldog had broken her head and shoulders off. But after all the people were gone away, the stranger who came with John said he could soon set her to rights. And then he brought out his box and rubbed the doll with some of the salve which he had cured the old woman with when she broke her leg. As soon as this was done, the doll's back became quite right again, her head and shoulders were fixed on, and she could even move her limbs by herself. There were now no occasion to pull the wires, for the doll acted just like a living creature, excepting she could not speak. The man whom the doll belonged to was quite delighted at having a doll who could dance of herself without being pulled by strings. None of his other dolls could do that. During the night, when all the people at the inn had gone to sleep, someone heard a sigh, so deep and so painful, and sighing continued for so long, that everyone got up to see what could be the matter. The showman went at once to his little theater, and found that it proceeded from the dolls, who all lay on the floor sighing pitifully, and staring with their glass eyes. They all wanted to be rubbed with the ointment, so that, like the queen, they might be able to move of themselves. The queen threw herself on her knees, took off her beautiful crown, and holding it in her hands, cried, "Take this from me, but do rub my husband and his courtiers." The poor man who owned the theater could scarcely refrain from weeping. He was so sorry he could not help them. Then he immediately spoke to John's comrade and promised him all the money he might receive at the next evening performance if he would only rub the ointment on 4 or 5 of his dolls. But the fellow traveler said he did not require anything in return excepting the sword which the showman wore by his side. As soon as he received the sword, he anointed 6 of the dolls with the ointment, and they were able to immediately dance so gracefully that all the living girls in the room could not help but joining in the dance. The coachman danced with the cook, and the waiters danced with the chambermaids, and all the strangers joined in too. Even the tongs and the fireplace shovel made an attempt, but they fell down after the first jump. So it was a very merry sight. The next morning, John and his companion left the inn to continue their journey through great pine forests and over high mountains. They arrived at last at such a great height that the towns and villages lay beneath them, and the church steeples looked like little specks between the green trees. They could see for miles around, far away to places they had never visited, and John saw more of the beautiful world than he had ever known before. The sun shone brightly in the blue firmament above, and through the clear mountain air came the sound of a huntsman's horn, and soft sweet notes brought tears into his eyes, for he could not help exclaiming, "How good and loving God is to give us all this beauty and loveliness in the world to make us happy." His fellow travelers stood by with folded hands, gazing on the dark wood and the towns bathed in the warm sunshine. At this moment there were sounds over their heads, sweet music. They looked up and discovered a large white swan, hovering over in the air, singing as no bird could ever sing before. But the song soon became weaker and weaker, and the bird's head drooped, and he sunk slowly down and lay dead at their feet. "It is a beautiful bird," said the traveler, "and these large white wings are worth a great deal of money. I will take them with me. You'll see now that a sword will be very useful." So he cut off the wings of the dead swan with one blow and carried them away with him. They now continued their journey over the mountains for many miles, till they reached at length a large city, containing hundreds of towers that shone in the sunshine like silver. In the midst of the city stood a splendid marble palace, roofed with pure red gold, in which dwelt a king. John and his companion would not go into the town immediately, so they stopped at an inn outside the town to change their clothes, for they wished to appear respectable as they walked through the streets. The landlord told them that the king was a very good man, who never injured anyone, but his daughter, "Heaven help us!" She was indeed a wicked princess. She possessed beauty enough. Nobody could be more elegant or prettier than she was. But what of that? She was a wicked witch, and in consequence of her conduct many noble princes had lost their lives. Anyone was at liberty to make her an offer. Were he the prince or beggar, it mattered not to her. She would ask him to guess 3 things which she had just thought of, and if he succeeded, he was to marry her, and be king over the land when her father died. But if he could not guess these 3 things, then she ordered him to be hanged or to have his head cut off. The old king, her father, was very much grieved at her conduct, but he could not prevent her from being so wicked, because he once said he would have nothing more to do with her lovers. She might do as she pleased. Each prince who came and tried the 3 guesses so that he might marry the princess had been unable to find them out and had been hanged or beheaded. They had all been warned in time and might have left her alone if they would. The old king became at last so distressed by these dreadful circumstances that for a whole day every year he and his soldiers knelt and prayed that the princess might become good, but she continued as wicked as ever. The old woman who drank brandy would color it black before they drank it to show how they mourned, and what more could they do? "What a horrible princess," said John. "She ought to be well flogged. If I were the old king, I would have her punished in some way." Just then they heard the people outside shouting, "Hurrah!" And looking out, they saw the princess passing by. And she was really so beautiful that everyone forgot her wickedness and shouted, "Hurrah! Hurrah!" 12 lovely maidens in white silk dresses holding golden tulips in their hands rode by her side on coal-black horses. The princess herself had a snow-white steed decked with diamonds and rubies. Her dress was of cloth of gold, and the whip she held in her hand looked like a sunbeam. The golden crown on her head glittered like the stars in heaven, and her mantle was formed of thousands of butterfly wings sewn all together. Yet she herself was more beautiful than all. When John saw her, his face became as red as a drop of blood. He could scarcely utter a word. The princess looked exactly like the beautiful lady with the golden crown of whom he dreamed of the night his father died. She appeared to him so lovely that he could not help loving her. It could not be true, he thought, that she really was a wicked witch who ordered people to be hanged or beheaded if they could not guess her thoughts. Everyone has permission to go and ask her hand, even the poorest beggar. "I shall pay a visit to the palace," he said. "I must go, for I cannot help myself." Then they all advised him not to attempt it, for he would surely share the same fate as the rest. His fellow traveler also tried to persuade him against not to do it, but John seemed quite sure of his success. He brushed his shoes and his coat, washed his face and his hands, combed his soft flaxen hair, and then went out alone into the town and walked to the palace. Well, that's it for today. We'll have to do part 2 tomorrow. I hope you're liking this story so far. It's got lots of adventure, and being good is really helping both John and his companions, so I think that's an important thing to remember. It's always a good thing to be a good person. Anyway, we'll continue this tomorrow. See you then.